The kingdom of Caerwyn lay in a valley green as emerald, encircled by nature's defenses. The Greyfong Mountains guarded the north, their peaks dusted with snow even in midsummer. The west was a wall of trees, the Mirewood, whose shadows were so deep that men claimed the sun itself feared to enter. To the south, the highlands of Bryn rolled away into mist, dotted with stone watchtowers and windswept fields. At the valley's heart, the river Leth wound silver between the hills, carrying barges laden with wool, grain, and wine to the castle town. And above it all, perched on a cliff of black granite, rose Caerwyn Castle, a fortress of towers and walls, old as the kingdom itself. Its stones had weathered 100 winters, its banners faded but proud. King Alaric ruled here, a tall man in his 60th year, with hair like winter frost and eyes sharp as a falcon's. His reign had been marked by uneasy peace. No wars within his walls, but constant threats beyond. The lords of Bryn were both his vassals and his rivals, bound by oath but ever watching for weakness. Lady Isolde of House Morvain had lived here since she was 12. Orphaned by a British raid, she had been taken in as the king's ward. The years had turned the frightened girl into a woman of quiet grace, with hair like sunlight and eyes the color of storm-lit seas. She moved through the court like a shadow of gold, noticed, admired, and kept at a distance. She had been promised since childhood to Lord Edric of Bryn, a man she barely knew but whose reputation preceded him. The marriage would seal an alliance, strengthen the border, and, though no one said it aloud, put Caerwyn's most beautiful woman in Edric's possession. But Edric was far away this summer, and Isolde's days followed the old rhythm. Morning prayers in the chapel, afternoons in the gardens or library, evenings in the Lady's Solar. It was a life of quiet patterns, until the day she met the knight with the raven banner. The orchard beyond the outer walls was nearly empty that afternoon. Isolde had brought a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with sketches of flowers. She sat beneath a pear tree, tracing the curve of a rose petal in charcoal, but the drawing displeased her. It looked lifeless. A sudden wind lifted the paper from her lap. She rose, but someone caught it before it touched the ground. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn surcoat stitched with a black raven. His hair was dark and fell in loose curls at the edges, his jaw shadowed with stubble. He studied the drawing before speaking. "Your hand is steady," he said, his voice low and edged with something like amusement. "But you've drawn the rose too perfect." She frowned. "Too perfect. A true rose has flaws. A torn petal, a speck of blight. Perfection is dead." "And what would a knight know of roses?" she asked, arching a brow. He shrugged. "More than you'd think. My mother kept a garden. I used to help her." He handed back the paper and bowed, simply, without the court's practiced flourishes. "Sir Rowan, sworn sword to the king." "Lady Isolde," she said, though she knew he already knew. For a moment their eyes met. Not long enough to be scandalous, but long enough to be remembered. She returned to her seat, but when he walked away, she found herself watching until the orchard swallowed him from sight. In the days that followed, she noticed him everywhere. Drilling in the yard at dawn, patrolling the walls at dusk, crossing the courtyard with the sure stride of a man who belonged. At first, their exchanges were brief. Once, she passed him in the cloister. "You walk alone too often," he said. "Alone, but not lonely," she replied. He smiled faintly. "That's what lonely people say." Another time, in the library, she found him poring over a weathered atlas. "You read?" she asked. "A map can win a battle as surely as a sword," he said, closing the book with care. By the first frost of winter, she had begun to look for him, though she told herself it was harmless. One evening, she lingered in the old watchtower beyond the east wall, staring at the frozen river. His boots crunched on the stone behind her. "You'll catch cold," he said. "Then you'll have to carry me back," she answered, her voice lighter than she felt. He looked at her for a long moment before saying softly, "I would." By spring, their meetings had taken on a rhythm neither spoke of. When she wished to see him, she left a sprig of rosemary on the bench in the herb garden. When he wished to see her, a raven's feather would appear on her window ledge. They spoke of small things at first, the curl of mist over the river at dawn, the smell of the ovens when bread was baking, the stray ginger cat that haunted the stables. But slowly, deeper truths surfaced. "My father was a knight," Rowan said one evening in the watchtower, the lantern between them casting gold over his face. "He gambled away our land, drank away our honor. When he died, all he left me was his sword and his shame. And yet you serve the king," she said. "I swore my oath to something greater than one man's folly." In return, she told him of her parents, of the night her home had burned, the British riders in the courtyard, the flash of steel, her father's blood on the threshold. He said nothing, but reached for her hand. His palm was rough, warm. She did not pull away. It was dangerous, this closeness. She knew it, but in his presence, the walls of the court seemed to vanish, and she could breathe. Lord Edric arrived with the spring thaw, bringing 30 men in British armor and a chest of gold for the king. He was as handsome as the rumors claimed, dark hair, strong jaw, fine clothes cut to flatter his form, but there was calculation in his every glance. At the feast held in his honor, Edric's hand rested over Isolde's a moment too long. Across the table, Rowan's eyes flicked toward her, then away. That night, in the torchlit stables, Edric approached Rowan. "You've been too near the lady," Edric said, his voice quiet but edged like a whetted blade. "I guard the king's ward," Rowan replied evenly. "Nothing more." "Guard her from a distance," Edric said, stepping closer. "For her sake, and yours." Rowan's jaw tightened. "If she were truly yours, you would not fear another man's company." Edric smiled without warmth. "I do not fear you, knight. I despise you, and that will be enough to end you." The days that followed were tense. Edric was attentive in public, all smiles and courtly gestures, but when no eyes were on him, his touch on Isolde's arm was bruising, his voice sharp. The court began to whisper. "They say the Raven Knight fights like a man with nothing to lose," murmured one lady. "Or something worth dying for," answered another. One evening, Isolde slipped the rosemary sprig into the garden bench. The next night, Rowan was waiting in the watchtower. His face was drawn. "You should not meet me now," he said. "You should not care," she replied. "I care more than is safe," he admitted. A week later, Rowan gave her a dagger, its hilt wrapped in black leather, the pommel set with a small onyx. "For when the world is not kind," he said. She traced the hilt with her fingers. "And when has it ever been kind?" He gave a short laugh. "Then keep it close." Their hands brushed as she took it, and in that fleeting touch she felt more truth than in 100 courtly speeches. News came from the south. A patrol had vanished near the border. Edric urged the king to send Rowan's unit to investigate, his voice smooth with feigned concern. Before Rowan left, Isolde met him in the chapel. The candles threw light across his armor, and she noticed the raven on his surcoat had been mended where it had torn. "You think Edric means you harm," she said. "I know it," he replied, "but if I return, it will be worth it." He left at dawn. For 12 days, she heard nothing. Rowan returned mud-streaked and weary, only to be met by the clink of chains. The charge was treason. Edric claimed Rowan had been seen meeting enemy riders, carrying messages beyond the border. He produced letters bearing Rowan's seal, offering aid to Cerwyn's enemies. In the great hall, Rowan stood bound but unbowed. "These are forgeries," he said. "You know this." King Alaric's voice was hard. "The evidence is strong. The evidence is bought," Rowan replied, his eyes on Edric. Isolde sat silent. To speak would be to accuse Edric, and likely join Rowan in the dungeons. The night before the execution, Isolde bribed the tower guards with her mother's silver ring. Rowan rose as she entered. "They will hang me at dawn," he said, as though speaking of the weather. "I will be there," she whispered. He stepped closer, the chains between them rattling. "If I could choose again, I would still have spoken to you in that orchard." And I would still have answered, she said, touching his cheek. For a moment, the world was only the sound of their breathing. Then the bells tolled midnight, and time moved again. The square was crowded before sunrise. Snow fell in slow, fat flakes, clinging to cloaks and hoods. The gallows stood at the center, a stark silhouette against the gray sky. Rowan was brought out in chains, his hair damp from melted snow, his eyes calm. He searched the crowd until he found her. The herald read the charges in a voice that carried across the square. Treason, conspiracy, oath-breaking. Each word was a lie hammered into law. When the rope was placed around his neck, Rowan spoke. I die for a truth no court will hear. I die for a love I will not deny. The crowd murmured. Edric's jaw tightened. The lever was pulled. And just like that, the raven banner fell. They buried him beyond the north wall, near the orchard where they first met. She came at dusk, her cloak heavy with snow, her hands empty. She had no flowers to give, only the memory of the dagger he'd given her. She pressed the blade into the frozen earth above his grave. If there is a world beyond this one, find me there, she whispered. That night, the snow turned to rain, and the graveyard was left empty, but for a single black feather at the foot of the mound. 2 weeks later, Edric pressed his suit for marriage. The king's ward should not remain unprotected, he told Alaric. I will give her safety, and a place in my hall. Safety. She knew what his safety meant. A cage gilded in British gold. She bowed her head. My lord, I am still in mourning. Then mourn quickly, Edric said, too low for the king to hear. Your grief will not change your fate. Spring came early that year. On the first warm evening, Isolde returned to the orchard. A raven sat in the pear tree above Rowan's grave, its black eyes fixed on her. When she stepped closer, it cawed once and dropped something at her feet. A sprig of rosemary, green and fragrant. Her breath caught. It was impossible, but she took it, pressing it to her lips as if it were his hand. That summer, she found the first letter, hidden in the spine of a book in the library. The handwriting was his. The words were short. If you read this, I am still yours. More letters followed, tucked into places only she would find. Under her seat in the chapel, behind a loose stone in the garden wall. Each one bore his hand, his phrasing, his way of knowing her. Edric's watch grew tighter, but she kept each letter, binding them with a black ribbon. At last, the king announced the betrothal. The hall was hung with garlands. Minstrels played soft ballads. Edric stood beside her, his hand heavy on hers. Across the hall, she thought she saw a figure in black, broad-shouldered, hair curling at the nape, but when she blinked, he was gone. That night, she dreamed of Rowan, not as he had been at the gallows, but alive, smiling, reaching for her hand in the orchard. The wedding was to be held in Bryn. Edric insisted on escorting her himself. On the road, the party camped beside the river Leth. In the night, she woke to the sound of a raven's call, close, urgent. She rose, wrapped in her cloak, and followed it into the trees. There, in the moonlight, she found a dagger driven into the trunk of an oak. His dagger, the leather still worn to her grip. The next day, the British captain rode beside her. My lady, he said quietly. Men say the Raven Knight rides again. Her pulse quickened. Rowan is dead. The captain shrugged. Then his ghost walks with steel in its hand. 2 of Edric's men vanished last night. Throats cut, clean work. She said nothing, but for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. When they reached Bryn, the city gates were spattered with blood. The guard spoke of an attack in the night. A single rider, cloaked in black, striking and vanishing like a shadow. Edric tightened security, posting men in the halls. But the night before the wedding, another letter found its way beneath her pillow. When the bells ring, follow the raven. The wedding day dawned cold and bright. The bells rang, not for the ceremony, but in alarm, Bryn's outer gate breached. In the chaos, a raven swooped through the chapel, startling the guests. Isolde slipped through the side door, her gown heavy, her heart faster than her steps. In the courtyard, a rider in black waited. She could not see his face, but when he reached for her, she took his hand without hesitation. They rode until the sun was high, the cold air biting at her cheeks. Only when the walls of Bryn were far behind did the rider slow. He pulled back his hood. Rowan's face was thinner, his eyes darker, but it was him. "You?" she began, but her voice broke. "They meant to kill me," he said, "but the hangman owed my father a debt. He cut the rope early, and I was smuggled away before the crowd could see." She touched his arm as though he might vanish if she didn't hold him. "And the letters? I had friends in the court," he said. "Not many, but enough. They found shelter in a hollow glen, hidden by a ring of pines." Rowan tended the fire while she wrapped her hands around a cup of broth. "We can't stay long," he said. "Edric will hunt us." She nodded. "Where will we go?" "There's a safe place west of here, an old abbey where my mother's kin still live. They'll hide us." Outside, the raven croaked, a low sound that seemed to echo in the trees. 3 nights later, the hunt began. Torches moved like fireflies along the ridge. The wind carried the distant bark of hounds. Rowan put out the fire and pulled her to her feet. "We ride now." Through the dark they fled, the raven swooping ahead like a guide. Twice they heard the clash of steel behind them. Rowan had laid false trails, leading some of Edric's riders into each other's path. At dawn, the torches were gone, but so was the raven. The abbey was half ruined, its stone walls overgrown with ivy. Rowan's aunt, Sister Mara, greeted them with no surprise. "I thought I'd see you again," she told Rowan, looking him up and down. "And you've brought trouble, as always." For a few days they were safe. Isolde walked in the cloister garden. Rowan mended his gear. But safety in war is a thin thing. One evening, Mara called them to the refectory. "A messenger from Cerwyn has come," she said. "He brings an offer. The king will pardon you both if you return and testify against Edric." Rowan's jaw tightened. "It's a trap." Isolde met his eyes. "And if it isn't?" They argued long after the candles burned low. She wanted justice. He wanted only to keep her far from Edric's reach. In Bryn, Edric learned of their survival. His fury was cold, not loud. "To catch the raven," he told his captain, "you clip the wings of the rose." He sent riders to Cerwyn, bearing forged letters in Isolde's name, letters offering herself to Edric in exchange for Rowan's life. When the abbey's gatekeeper announced a visitor, Isolde went alone to the outer court. The man claimed to be from the king, bringing word of Rowan's full pardon. "They say Edric has fled Bryn," he told her. "You are wanted at the capital." Rowan was away, scouting the hills. By the time he returned, she was gone. She realized the truth too late. The messenger took her not to Cerwyn, but toward Bryn, riding hard. At night, he bound her hands. "If you value your life," he said, "you'll do as Lord Edric commands." In the dark, she prayed for the raven's cry, but only the wind answered. Rowan caught them at Blackwater Ford. His sword flashed in the moonlight, cutting the reins of the messenger's horse. The fight was short but brutal. When it was done, he knelt beside her, cutting her bonds. "You'll have to stop getting stolen," he said, but his voice shook. She gripped his hand. "You came. I always will." They did not return to the abbey. Instead, they camped deep in the pines, where no road reached. Rowan took her hands. "If Edric comes again, I will end it. No more running." "And if that means your death?" she asked. "Then I will die with my sword in my hand and your name on my lips." She kissed him, the wind cold around them, the pine needles whispering like witnesses. News came through the mountain traders. Edric had rallied British forces, claiming Cerwyn harbored traitors. Skirmishes broke out along the border. In the pines, Rowan sharpened his blade while Isolde ground herbs for the fire. "If war comes," she said, "it won't stop at the border." He looked at her, the whetstone pausing in his hand. "Then we make sure Edric doesn't live to see it." Edric rode with 50 men combing the high passes. He carried no banner, only the raven feather he had plucked from Rowan's cloak years before. A taunt, a promise. Find him, he told his captain, and burn the forest to the roots if you must. Rowan struck first. At the narrow pass of Harrow's Gate, he and 2 loyal Cerwyn scouts loosed a rockslide that crushed Edric's vanguard. The survivors fled back down the slope. Isolde, watching from above, saw Edric himself ride clear of the falling stones. He looked up, and even from that distance, she could feel his gaze like a blade. That night, Rowan held her by the fire. "If I don't come back from tomorrow's fight, you will," she interrupted. "Listen," he insisted. "If I fall, go north to my mother's kin. Don't try to avenge me." She said nothing. Her silence was the only lie she had ever told him. At dawn, they met Edric's force on the frozen banks of the River Leth. Steel rang on steel, the air filled with the cries of men and horses. Rowan fought like the stories, fast, unyielding, the raven's shadow on his shoulder. He cut through 2 of Edric's guards before facing the man himself. Their swords locked. Edric grinned. "You should have stayed dead." The duel drove them onto the ice. Cracks spidered beneath their boots. Edric feinted left, then drove his blade under Rowan's guard. The point bit into his side shallow, but enough to send him to one knee. Isolde screamed his name, but the roar of the river drowned her voice. Rowan surged upward, knocking Edric's sword aside. In the same motion, he drove his dagger into Edric's chest. The British lord staggered back, the ice breaking beneath him. He fell into the black water, the current dragging him under. When the river closed, the forest fell silent. They won the battle, but Rowan's wound festered. Fever took him on the 3rd night, leaving him shivering even by the fire. "Don't you dare leave me now," she whispered, holding the cool cloth to his brow. He smiled faintly. "You were always the stubborn one." Sister Mara sent word. If they could reach the abbey, she might save him. But the journey was long, and the fever burned fast. Rowan took her hand. "If I slow you down, promise me you'll ride without me." "I will not make that promise," she said, and meant it. They left before dawn, the raven flying ahead. Rowan leaned against her in the saddle, his breath warm on her neck, too shallow, too slow. At the crest of the ridge, the abbey spire came into view, but by the time they reached the gate, his head had fallen against her shoulder. The raven landed on the wall above them, silent. Sister Mara and 2 novices carried Rowan into the abbey's infirmary. His skin was pale, his lips dry. "We'll do what we can," Mara said, but Isolde saw the truth in her eyes. All night, she sat by his side, wiping the sweat from his brow, whispering the old songs they had once sung in the gardens of Cerwyn. Near midnight, Rowan stirred. "You remember the watchtower?" he asked, voice thin. "How could I forget? You smelled of horses and pine, and I thought you too bold by half." "I was," he said, smiling faintly. "But you looked at me as if I were something worth believing in." "Isolde," he murmured. "When I am gone, don't hide in stone walls. Find the sun again." Her tears fell onto his hand. "I would rather follow you into the dark." "You already have," he whispered. At dawn, the raven called from the abbey wall. Rowan opened his eyes for the last time, looking toward the sound. "That's our guide," he said softly. Then, with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of every road they had traveled, he was still. They buried him outside the abbey, beyond consecrated ground, as he had been condemned once before. Isolde laid a single red rose on the fresh earth. The raven circled above, cawing once before disappearing into the pines. She stayed at the abbey, but the walls felt smaller with each passing day. Without Rowan's laughter, the gardens were only shadows of green. Sister Mara found her one morning packing a small satchel. "You'll chase ghosts," she warned. "I know," Isolde replied, "but he is the only ghost I wish to find." Isolde traveled from village to village, speaking to those who had fought beside Rowan, gathering fragments of his life before they had met. At night, she dreamed of the orchard where they had first spoken, but in the dream, he always walked away before she could reach him. Years later, she returned to Caerwyn. The watchtower was crumbling, the gardens overgrown. She found the old stone bench where Rowan had first told her of the raven. On the bench was a single black feather, though no bird stirred in the air. As winter set in, her health waned. She spent her last days in a small room overlooking the gardens. Sometimes she spoke to someone no one else could see. On the final night, a servant swore they heard two voices in the room, hers and a man's. Isolde was buried in the chapel crypt. In spring, a rosebush grew over Rowan's grave beyond the walls, and a raven nested among its branches. Each dawn, the bird flew to the chapel door, leaving a single red rose there. The monks said it was only chance. The villagers swore it was love. And in Caerwyn's oldest songs, they say that when the wind is still and the pines are quiet, you can hear two voices laughing together in the orchard, the rose and the raven, walking side by side forever.